It's all about death, not fertility. Hi, my name's Will. I've been a traditional Gardnerian initiate for about 20 years, and I'm the High Priest of Coven in London. I'm hoping today to help clear up some wild misconceptions. First off, the title of this video. It's clickbait, not true. Remember that, whenever you see a post, the person posting is fighting for your attention, and catchy, provocative titles are a must. When it comes to something as deep and philosophically meaningful as I have found traditional Wicca to be, short, catchy titles are certainly going to miss a huge amount out. So let's jump into it and try to pick apart a few of these attempts to simplify the deeply complex philosophy and meanings to be found in Gardnerian Wicca. Let's take a deep breath and look at how the claim that Wicca is all about fertility just isn't supported by the public writings of Gerald Gardner. What Gardner presented in his public work is plain and simple: a death and resurrection religion. The cycle of life, and most importantly, death, is central to the myths and rituals. Fertility is a tool, a mechanism by which the greater mysteries can be explored, and does not represent any sort of absolute pinnacle of understanding or meaning. Let us start by exploring what he said in Witchcraft Today and the meaning of witchcraft about fertility. First, we have to accept fertility is rarely ever presented in isolation when discussing the actual practices of the witches Gardner refers to. The majority of the time it is referenced, he is discussing his understanding of historical practices assigned to witches or alleged practices of the Templars. Very often, the references to fertility dances and charms describe practices the witches can undertake, but are not assigned any greater significance than any of the other rituals or spells they could perform. The actual term a fertility cult is used a total of 4 times across Witchcraft Today and the meaning of witchcraft. In Witchcraft Today, it is only used in relation to the Templars. And here I'll put the page up for you so you can read along. Another charge was that the Templars worshipped a head, variously described as having sometimes 3 faces, sometimes simply a human skull or death's head, that they believed that this head had the power to make them rich, cause the trees to flourish, and the earth to become fruitful. In commas, we could call it a fertility cult. So nothing there in relation to the witches' practice at all. We might have better luck with the term in the book The Meaning of Witchcraft. Here we find it 3 times. Once talking about Druids and Sumerian priests, and the other 2 times when quoting a different book entirely, Prehistoric Britain. So I don't think that does the argument very much good. How about we widen the scope and just look at the references to fertility across these 2 books? In Witchcraft Today, he refers to a letter dated September 29th, 1952, when he was told that a ritual had taken place, which included fertility dances on broomsticks, performed the proper seasonal as well as other rites, and had some of the old dances. The fertility dance was a separate action to the proper seasonal as well as other rites. It was an appropriate activity, probably because of the time of year, not a key part of the rite. It is placed in the description he gives between the circle casting and the actual rite itself, with some dancing to end the event. Let's have a little look at what Gardner said the cult wanted. He says in chapter 6, what they wanted was prosperity and fertility for the tribe. Now, if I were trying to present an argument that fertility is the be-all and end-all of Wicca, then I'd stop there. However, it continues. A life after death in happy conditions and reincarnation into their tribe or nation. I think when put in context, yet again, fertility is only part of what is desired. Prosperity, a happy afterlife, reincarnation, and fertility is only one of 4 described things that are said to be the main objective of the cult. The most standalone references to the importance of fertility in Witchcraft Today are actually in relation to the Templars, not witches. In chapter 8 of Witchcraft Today, Gardner presents the argument that witchcraft, as he saw it, was a blending of indigenous fertility cults and later magical practices, which he attributes to Egyptian influences. He also says that all this is intensely interesting to the witches themselves. They have vague stories that the cult comes from the east, the Summerland, combined with a story that it had existed since the goddess went to the land of death. How interesting that they mark the beginning of their cult as to when the goddess went to the land of death, not reborn from death, not born at all, not even returned, but rather when she went to death. The cult doesn't start with fertility, it starts with death. You might even argue that people who are only interested in fertility aren't witches at all. As Gardner said, these were not really witches in any sense. Fertility was what they wanted. Good crops, good fishing, good luck. They would attend the meetings of any god who was good to them, and goodness to them was the quality of one who helped you when in trouble and who had merry festivals. These people were not dedicated to the gods. They were only interested in what they could gain from following the structures presented by the priests of gods. Perhaps we can find some more support for the fertility is everything argument in the meaning of witchcraft. The unseen powers that have interested man most in his early history have been the powers of fertility. There we are, we're off to a good start. But only if the sentence stopped there, which it doesn't. It continues. And of contact with the spirit world of life and death. That pesky pairing with death again. Almost as the two are somehow interlinked, equally important, entwined in some way, as to mean that there's something about the two of them at least that's important. Maybe we can look at some explicit references to the witches practicing fertility rites. How about the energy expended in the games was thought of as giving new strength to the god to bring fertility to the land. In commas, witches dance at Lammas today with the same objective. Here we go, a good, clear reference to a dance performed at a certain time of year to encourage fertility of the land. But then it goes on to list a whole bunch of other themes for other times of the year. It wasn't all fertility rites all the time. Odd if the whole practice of Wicca is supposed to be about fertility. Gardner goes on to talk more about these festivals and celebrations. He says, it will be noticed that these 4 ancient festivals neatly divide the year into 4 parts, from which they are sometimes known as the 4 cross-quarter days. Their origins have been something of a puzzle. It has been suggested that they are connected with the seasons of fertility in animals. So perhaps here is our point where all the ritual's connection to fertility is explained. Unfortunately not. He actually goes on to say, I would like to advance a suggestion in this connection, which I do not think has been made before. The 4 great Sabbats each take place when the sun is in one of the 4 fixed signs of the zodiac. He then goes into a whole discussion about zodiacs and elements. He is actually arguing that the origins of the festivals aren't connected to animal fertility at all. What about the witches believed in fertility rites and would use all their powers to make each small community grow? Well, this isn't really saying anything other than that the witches believed in a type of rite and that that particular rite worked. As much could be said about healing or divination rites. In total, there are 90 references to fertility in witchcraft today and in the meaning of witchcraft. So how about we now take a look at the 140 plus references to death? First reference we get is when Gardner tries to talk around why witches do what they do. At the end of a long list of reasons that people perform initiation rituals, he speaks about a ritual of death and resurrection. But, I hear you cry, resurrection is fertility. Okay, let's say it is. But then it is once again paired with death. You cannot claim resurrection supports an argument that is all about fertility, but ignore that equally is important the aspect of death. So I say that at best this shows the two are fundamentally linked. Now let's keep exploring these references to death in witchcraft today. Gardner talks about how a stand-in for a high priest at a ritual could be a skull and crossbones. He also talks about how nowadays the high priestess stands in a position representing the skull and crossbones, or death, and moves to another position, a pentacle, representing resurrection during the rites. This appears to clearly show a separation between these two, and that both are important but embodied differently. The god figure is repeatedly associated with the aspect of death, called at times god of death and hunting. In another quote, my witches speak of him as god of death and what lies beyond. The cult god is thought of as the god of the next world, or of death and resurrection. He is referred to constantly as the god of death. In a religion with just 2 deities, one of them is constantly titled with death, odd if really the whole thing is about fertility. But perhaps we are saved when we look at the other deity, the goddess. Later, when it was also used to attain fertility, a fertility goddess came into the cult. Oh, so the goddess as a fertility figure came in later, when it was also used to obtain fertility. Also, as in it wasn't the sole thing at all, just another aspect. Later, she is described as the great mother of all, the giver of fertility and the power of reproduction. So this looks good for the fertility argument. It directly references her as the giver of fertility. But that isn't what she is. It is just something that is within her gift to give. When discussing her title, she is actually called the goddess of life, death, and rebirth. Later, when explaining some of the witch's beliefs, he refers to the idea that there are 3 great events in the life of man: love, death, and resurrection in the new body. Nothing about fertility there. I can agree that fertility is required for one of these things, but it isn't even important enough to be directly referenced. To argue that any one part of the gods and of Wicca is what it is all about is to fundamentally misunderstand the history of Wicca and the writings of Gardner himself. He constantly refers to the gods with a range of titles. He says, the dual nature of the old god will be noticed. He is the giver of fertility, both of the ground and of humans and animals, but he is also Lord of the gates of death. In relation to the goddess, he says, their goddess is the mother of fertility in all its forms, whether it be the fertility of the earth, of cattle and human beings, or the material prosperity of some venture, or those more subtle forms of fertility which germinate in the mind and bring forth poetry and the arts. I could choose to approach these texts with a preconceived idea of what Wicca is all about, and pick those quotes which only support my opinion, but that isn't honest, and misrepresents the depth that actually resides in Wicca. It is tempting to make big claims and give simple answers, because that is what most of us are looking for. But that isn't a mystery tradition. If you are just looking for a way to confirm your preconceived biases, then there are plenty of ideologies out there to pick from. Just find the one that agrees with you, and you can surround yourself in the comforting blanket of conformity. The idea that Wicca is about death, resurrection, reincarnation is not a new one. It is, in fact, the oldest core principle of the New Forest Coven. The members of the coven were drawn together because of a feeling they had known each other before and wished to know each other again. Fertility is a key requirement of the cycle that witches explore, but to give it such precedence as to say it is what Wicca is all about is to fundamentally misunderstand the rituals and cycles we practice, and Gardner's public writings about the craft. It is fine to emphasize fertility in your personal practice, but it isn't the foundations of Gardnerian Wicca. Personal preference doesn't mean you get to ignore the full depth of traditional Gardnerian Wicca.